Okay, I think we can begin, right? Um, yeah. So I think we were in the middle of discussing the problem of Ishto Nida. So again, a little bit of background just to get us back to where we were before the break. So the Mishnah on in the beginning of the Masechta, which we've been discussing all year, but we've been bouncing, you know, from from Daf Chaf to Daf Yud Aleph to Daf Dalid back and forth, Mem Dalid, Mem Tes. So, but the original Mishnah basically says that there are 15, arayos that are excluded from Ibam and Chalitza, and that also exempt Tsaros. That's the Mishnah we've been dealing with. That Mishnah is repeated again on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, which is
Hello.
very important context.
Hi there. How you doing, Andre?
So
Everybody all right?
in analyzing
Okay.
these
I'll be walking
15,
out. Thanks.
I would say that, the way that we've been, focusing in the last couple of topics is that there are two characteristics that apply to this group of 15. Okay, one is that each one of them is um, is a prohibited relationship on the level of a capital offense, meaning either bidei shamayim, kares, or bidei adam, which is even worse. So these are illicit relationships that trigger a very severe punishment. And as such, the principle of ase dochalos ase, which otherwise would apply, for example, to chayve lavin in the case of yibum, because you have the mitzvah of yibum, it says v'yibma ulakachalo isha. So even though she's an eshasach, right, that's the unique din of yibum. But what the Gemara says is that if it's the Mishnah says in Daf Chaf and Aleph that if we're dealing with chayve lavin or things of that sort, so then Yibum will override those based on the universal principle of ase dochalos ase. But the Gemara says on Dav Gimel that when it comes to a lav sheish bakares, ein ase dochalos ase sheish bakares. So from that point of view, the 15 cases of the Mishnah, all of which are arayos and more than and kares plus, are excluded from the heter of ase dochalos ase. But there's another factor. If you want to describe the reason why those 15 examples or categories or individuals are excluded from Ibam and Chalitza, there would have been another formulation. Not that there's no heter to do the act of Ibum because it doesn't fall into the rubric of Ase Dochalos Ase because it's Yesh Bakares or worse, but rather because the relationship itself is a incestuous or an illicit relationship, and it's just not tolerable to have a marital relationship, which is what Yibum would become once it was pursued. That's what Pasuk says, V'yibma ulakachalo isha. So it's not tolerable to have that when the parties of the marriage are incompatible halachically. And that incompatibility means that it's a illicit relationship, which is not consistent with the sanctity of marriage. So, in
So
addition
saying
to
it would
the,
have no validity even if it was done.
say that again.
It would have no validity even if they did it because it just can't exist in that kind of environment.
Yeah,
So the
exactly.
act itself would be a non-act.
The effort or the result would be the problem, not just the heter of the action itself. So basically, these are two, and they're not mutually exclusive, but they are two different elements, each of which seems to be adequate or sufficient or self-sufficient, we'll say. For either of these reasons, you could explain that there's no yibum, that there's no chalitza, that that the tsaros are excluded, and so on. So, but the trick, what we've been discussing the last number of shiurim, is to try to isolate these from each other. Are there circumstances where the relationships are inappropriate and illicit, even though technically you have a heter of ase dochalos ase? That's one question. So, for example, that was our discussion
Wow.
about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, Oliver Shas, and we saw it here in
Lavin is
Yevamos,
also
that Chayve Lavin are produce
possible.
mamzerim, and Chayve Lavin, there's no tfisas kiddushin. And maybe, this is part of the question, maybe that the Chayve Lavin are even a kind of an erva, even though they're not in the Parsha of Arayos. But nonetheless, they are a kind of erva.
Is it that
And
Chayvi Lavin
therefore,
are erva, or is it that erva is a separate category, and that even if it isn't subject to kares, it also has a problem because its name is erva?
well, I'm saying we don't know in Rabbi Akiva. This is what we discussed when we discussed Rabbi Akiva. Like, this is the question that Tosas asked. Tosas on Daf Tes. Amid Aleph says, let's even Rabbi Akiva believes in the principle of Aseh Dochalos Aseh, even though a lav, for him in Ishus is an illicit relationship, cannot sustain a marriage, will produce mamzerim. Nonetheless, he does believe in the principle of aseh dochalos aseh. So
But
why not say
the exception may be an erva. The exception may be if it's called an erva.
Yeah, so that's why I'm. So some of the Rishonim, if you look at the Ramban, the Tosa Rosh, and so on, that this is Tosa's question. Tosa says, why does Rabbi Akiva seem to apply his principle of Chayve Lavin for Mamzerus and Tfisas Kiddushin also to Yibum? Yibum should be different because there's a mitzvah say, and the mitzvah say should trigger Aseh Dochalos Aseh. So the Tosa doesn't give an answer to this question. They leave it b'tzarchiyun, but the Ramban and the Tosar Rosh, they do give answers. And I think what they're struggling to say is there might be technically a heter of aseh dochalos aseh, but if the reasoning behind Rabbi Akiva's no tfisas kiddushin and mamzerus is the fact that there's a kind of an erva, so then you still can't justify this union. It's still an illicit union, even if there was a heter to do the physical action of one yibum, it still wouldn't create a kinyan ishus because the kinyan ishus is excluded by the status of erva. If you assume that, again, to make it clear, there's a parsha of Araya. It's the parsha we read in last week's. We're going to look at the parsha for a minute anyway, but it's in Parshas Achrei Mos. It's a very extraordinary parsha. Maybe we'll look at it for a minute. And by the way, there are two parshas. One is in Achrei Mos, and the other one is coming up this coming week. In current events, Parshas Kedoshim has a second, slightly different rendition of the parsha of Arayos, which is interesting in its own right. But Chayve Lavin don't appear in that parsha. So when the Torah uses the expression arayos, it's the cases of Achrei Mos and Kedoshim, and all of them are capital offenses plus. But since Rabbi Akiva has this very remarkable view about Mamzerus and Tfisas Kedushin, that's where the Rishonim came up with the idea that there's the erva or the arayos of capital crime, and there's a lesser erva, but there's still erva. So anyway, that's one example. The second example that we saw and we spent time on was what about Eshes Ish? So that sounds like a strange, question. How could you have a Yibum case, which is also an Eshes Ish case? Every Yibum case deals with an almana, a widow, right? Her husband just died. So what are we talking about Eshes Ish? So again, the ingenious Chachamim, were able to imagine these cases. So the way it comes out is the way they explained it is, let's say you have the following scenario. Let's say Avram is married to Sarah. Avram divorces Sarah, but Avram divorces Sarah on condition that she not marry Shimon. Right? She said, this is a divorce. You can marry anybody in the world you want with the exclusion of Shimon. So, of course, she goes ahead and she marries not Shimon, because that would undo her divorce and make her an Eshes Ish. She goes ahead and she marries Shimon's brother, the next best thing. So she marries Ruvain. And then, of course, Ruvain dies, so that now she's omedes liibum to Shimon. If she were to implement the yibum with Shimon, then it would turn out that in retrospect, she was an Eshes Ish. So that's the big, massive Tosas on Daf Yudam and Aleph, and the Ramban and the Rajba, so on. So again, one of the things I was trying to show was it's a funny kind of a case, as Ramban puts it, but already Bali Tosas put it. It's a remarkable kind of a case. If you look at it from the perspective of implementing Yibum,
stay tuned for the best of Carson.
if you want to implement Yibum, then you're going to trigger Eishasish. If the problem is, who is a proper marriage partner for Yibum, then she's not an Eishasish at all. I mean, as a candidate, she is, Grusha and was Grusha from Abraham and is now an almana of Ruvain. Just that he can't implement the Yibum, but there's no reason he can't do Chalitza, and there's no reason that should be Pota the Tsaros. So Bali Tosas take this question very seriously, and some of them think it really is a problem. And I believe it's because in both cases, the Rabbi Kiva and this case, because they hold the
involve a wire hanger.
And since they hold the principle of Dechuya,
okay, I'm not going to keep.
So basically the idea is that everything focuses on the heter of Yibum. Is there a heter of Yibum or no?
Check the obituaries to see if anybody good died.
Now, if the Ramban is mostly convinced that the problem of Yibum is a problem of Hutra, not a problem
of Russia is a gentleman by the name of Constantine.
So, yeah, somebody has to. I think
somebody has to turn off the audio.
Yeah,
Ezra, please mute yourself.
He was just relieved the doctor didn't tell him he had a cold.
Yeah. Anyways,
can I ask a point of halacha
what's that?
Can I ask a point of halacha question?
I just can't hear. Just 1 second.
Tasty pudding award, right? That's a big honor.
If everybody could possibly mute, that would be good.
Barstool School of
or mute other things.
Anyway. Ezra Merkin, your microphone is still on, and it's indicating we're all hearing you. Some radio in the background or a TV.
Yeah. Okay. We're good now.
When this provision was made for poor Sarah that she cannot marry Shimon, when you say marry, are we talking kedushin or nisuin or both?
So that's a great question.
Because if it's kedushin, then she's already in trouble when she becomes zikuk for Yibum, because that the zikuka, so to speak, is equivalent to kedushin.
Not. I mean, it isn't. That's a whole argument in the Gemara itself, right? Whether Zika
it's far more complicated if we believe that Tanai includes kedushin.
Right. But Pashtus, it's shalotinase. And the way Tosas puts it, it's shalotinase v'shalotivael, both. You shouldn't do either. But you're right. But either way, it should be known that the status of Zika, whether Zika is kiknusa, which is like, Ishas, is a big debate in the Gemara, whether or not, for example, let's say, if there's a Zika relationship, is there an automatic prohibition to like the sister of this kuka? In other words, let's say
before Yibum Chalitza or after Yibum Chalitza?
Before, in the state of Zika, meaning, let's say Reuven dies and his brother Shimon now has a Zika relationship with Reuven's wife, I don't know, Leah. And let's say Leah has a sister, Rachel, right? So, or a mother, I don't know, again, whatever. So is there, since there's a Zika relationship, does that automatically exclude, in the same way that an Ishus would? So this is a big debate in the Gemara. I don't want to get into it right now, but it's a massive discussion. Okay. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is, but I'm just reviewing for a minute, is that there are a number of cases where the Bali Tosas seem very focused on the permissible implementation of Yibum, and the Ramban and his school are very focused on the nature of the relationships and, whether or not this is an appropriate marriage after the fact. So this is the background for the discussion of Nida. So now if we look at Nida on Dav Beis, this is what you have the Marmakomas in front of you, or the Tosas on Dav Beis. We're back to Dav Beis because this is where Tosas happens to discuss this question, but it's a very fascinating question. It's the bottom Tosas on Beis Amid Aleph Achos Ishto, and it goes as follows. This is the question. What happened if the woman, again, let's say Ruvain was married to Sarah, okay? And when Ruvain died, Sarah was in a state of nida. Okay, so there would be a prohibition for her to be misyavemes to the brother Shimon because she's a nida. And even though there's a mitzaseh of yibum, right? It's einase do kalosase sheesh bakares. A nida is kares. So from a heter based on ase do kalosase nida, like I should also add, we're going to read this inside just a minute, that nida is in the parsha of Achremos and Kedoshim as one of the arayos. Okay, so from the perspective of implementing Yibum, there would be no heter while she was a nida to do so. However, is that a good enough reason to forever exclude this Yibum and also Chalitza and also Tsaros? That seems wrong. The question is, it's like a Minchas Chinuch question, like we call it. Like, what's wrong with it? You have to be able to not just to say
I
it's
don't
wrong, but
understand the Havamina. I mean, it's a natural course of life
right.
that women of certain age.
So we'll see. That might be what Tosas answers, but what Tosas Havamina was that it's also based on one other idea, and that's the idea of Nasra. The idea of Nasra is
That
the
once
idea.
somebody is Nesra, they can never. But if we follow that out, then no married couple could ever exist.
Well, no, because there's no din of Nasra in a regular Isha. This is only a din of Nasra in the beginning of the Zika of Yibum. So what is Nasra? So let's just look for 1 minute on Daf Lamed Amud
So
Aleph.
if somebody gets married to a woman who's a Nida, then
Yeah.
then he can never live with her again? Because she was Nesra at the time they were married?
No, there's no din of Nasra in a regular marriage. There's only a din of Nasra in the Zika of Yibum.
I mean, we have a general thing that's when something is also, at least there's one, at least there's this certain who hold that way, that once something is also, it can never become mutter again. We have that
No.
whole back and forth on that. No, once. No.
not in something that's that's a temporary. No, but that
No,
we
I'm
do
saying
have that
not
in.
when it's temporary, but I'm saying once something became also, even if later on it can become not something that's cyclical, like neither, but if there's something
Right.
that became
I mean,
also,
that's something. It depends what and which area of halal. So again, we do have the reason this is a question is because of this notion of Nasra, which is a very murky notion, as we'll see in a moment. Like, what is it, Rabbanan? Is it Daraisa? Does it apply in a technical way? That's one of the things I want to discuss. So first, let me get Nasra on the record. Nasra on the record is the Mishnah on Lamed Amud Aleph. It's really the Gemara earlier on Chav Zayin and Chav Ches, but just to look at it very quickly on Lamed Amud Aleph is the Mishnah. The Mishnah says Shlosha Achin. Let's say there are 3 brothers: Ruvain, Shimon, Levi. Shnai mehem nesuim shtei achios. 2 brothers married 2 sisters. Ruvain married Rachel. Shimon married Leah. There's a 3rd brother, Levi. He just married, it says here, Nochris. Nochris doesn't mean a non-Jew here. Nochris means a non-sister.
outside the family.
The other 2 married sisters, and he married somebody
Outside
from
the
another
family.
family, right? So that's the Shlosha Achim Shnayim Mehem Nesum Shtei Achios, the Echad Nasi Nachris. So then what happens? Meis Echad Mibale Achios. Ruvain dies. One of the brothers dies. Now he's married to Rachel. So Vekines Nasi Nachris Es Ishto. Shimon initially cannot be Miyavim Rachel because he's married to Leah. She's Achos Ishto, and therefore she rather, meaning Rachel, is not a candidate for Shimon. But Levi, who's married to some other woman, not a sister, he can marry Rachel through Yibum, and he does. But then, of course, what happens is, Mesa Ishtol Shalsheni. Then Shimon's wife, Leah, dies. In other words, first Ruvain, who's married to Rachel, dies. Then Levi, the 3rd brother, is Miyabim Rachel. Then Leah, the sister of Rachel, the wife of Shimon, then she dies. At this point, Rachel is hopefully happily, married through Yibum to Levi, but not so fast, right? Achakach, Nes, Nesui, Nachris. The next part of the story is Levi dies. So when Levi dies, Rachel is back up for Yibum with Shimon. But now there's no obstacle
because the sister's
because
dead.
Leah, who was the sister of Rachel,
And
was the reason that Shimon. Yeah, but now that she died, there's no problem of Achos Ishto. So he should be able to be miyabim her, right? No. The answer is that's the din of Nasra. Says the Mishnah, Harei zu asura alav olamis. She, meaning Rachel, is prohibited to Shimon forever. Hol v'Nasra alav sha'achas. But that's a concept in Zika. That's not a concept in regular Ishus. It's a concept of Zika, and it's probably related to the principle of Esha Sach. If the Heter Yibum didn't apply, and it was considered Esha Sach, so you're stuck with that. Okay. So what Tosas wants to say, and I'll now turn back to Beis Amud Aleph for a minute, or for more than a minute. What Tosas wants to say is as follows. Let's say the woman, let's say Reuven is married to Sarah, and then Reuven dies, while Sarah is a Nida. So Shimon cannot be miyabim Sarah at that time because it's chayvik risus. What will you say? Let's just wait a week or a day or 2 weeks or
Where
whatever.
Is the imperative?
This one
do it
second.
immediately.
I just want to get the question on the record first. So what will you say? Let's just wait it out, and then she won't be a nida, and then Shimon could be miyabim her. Says Tosas, why don't we apply the principle of Nasra, which means that if at the beginning of the Zika there was an obstacle, that obstacle, even if it goes away, is still ma'akev. Just like originally Shimon could not be miyabim Rachel because his wife Leah was her sister, but that prohibition continues even after Leah dies. So same way, if there was a prohibition to be miyabim because of nida, why not say that prohibition persists even after she's no longer a nida?
But Tosas is assuming that the Yibum has a time bomb on it, that it must be done immediately. It's not the case with Yibum.
No, but
many reasons why Yibum could take 3 weeks to take.
No. Tosas is not assuming that. Tosas is invoking the din of Nasra, which assumes that the beginning of the Zika is Kovea Lagabe Nasra. It doesn't mean that the
but there is a difference, because the basic of idea of Nasra is that at some point that party was permanently unable to have.
Well, that might be an answer, but that's not the answer that you just gave a second ago.
No,
right?
no, but what I'm saying is that the Havamin itself that says that just because this moment you can't do something.
It's not any moment. It's the moment that what Nasra Nasra does, to be fair, Nasra does seem to put a huge emphasis on Tchilas Hazika, on the moment of the Misas Habal and the Tchilas Hazika. Because otherwise, let's say, forget about the case that we just did in the Mishnah.
Normal Nasra, as I understand it.
I'll give you a simpler case. Let's say the following happens. Let's say Reuven and Shimon are brothers, right? Married to 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. Forget about Levi. I'll just give you a simpler case, right? So let's say Reuven dies, right, on Tuesday. Okay? And when he dies, Leah is still married, is still alive and married to Shimon. And let's say on Wednesday, another tragedy happens in the family and Leah dies. Okay? Now on Thursday, is there any reason why Reuven cannot? It's only 2 days since it's only 2 days since Reuven died.
Yes, there's a glaring difference. when the first death occurred, okay, Shimon was permanently unable to marry Leah or Rachel. I forget who was
right. But that's not. I
permanently.
agree with you. We'll have to figure out whether
the Zika situation, he was never permanently barred from Yibum. It was always known to be a temporary issue. And not only that, Yibum doesn't have a clock on it. Many times it could take months to the brothers.
Right. But what I'm saying, you said the second point, and then you said the first point. The first point is a potential answer to this question and a potential chiluk. But the second point is irrelevant unless you say the first point, because what you see from the classic cases of Nasra, is that even though Yibum could happen at any point, it could happen later, the Nasra is defined by the first moment of the Zika.
But that may be the case.
By the way, I'll just highlight it
only if at that moment there's a permanent injunction against.
No, that's right. That's the second point that you're making.
You have to go together. You can't separate them.
No, they're
totally different. Nasra has
you can't separate them.
Well,
there are two different issues. One is, for example, I'll give you another case. Let's say, this is a little bit controversial, but whatever. There's another case that the Gemara discusses, which is a machlokes, and that is not Nasra mitchila being prohibited olamis, but let's say you have hutra v'nasra v'hutra. So, for example,
that's what I thought I was talking about before.
Yeah. So hutra v'nasra v'hutra is like this: Ruvain married Rachel, and then he died. So now Shimon could be miyavim Rachel, correct? But let's say instead he chooses to go out and marry her sister Leah. So that's not the typical Nasra. That's not Nasra, Olamis. That's Hutra v'Nasra. Now, once he marries, assuming that he can, that once he marries Leah, he can no longer be miyavim Rachel, right? But let's say the next day, or in a week, or in a month, or in a year, it doesn't matter. Before anything happens with Rachel, let's say Leah then dies. So that's called Hutra v'Nasra v'Hutra. There already, the Gemara isn't so sure that won't be permissible, right? So the din of Nasra really does focus on Tchilas Hazika. Because since that is when the Chi of Yibum or the Zika, whatever you want to call it, is triggered, so that, that determines, is it Eshasach or is it Yibum? As opposed to, let's say, Hutra v'Nasra v'Hutra, or something like that, where, it's a Yibum case, just there's now an obstacle, but the obstacle went away. Anyways, but your distinction about Nida in terms of, this is a known temporary, as opposed to Achos Ishto, which might terminate at some point, but it's not predictable, and it's not fundamentally a temporary, could be a permanent. Well, we wish everybody Arichos Yomim, right? That is a correct distinction. And some Rishonim do make that distinction, and we'll get to it. Okay, so getting back to Tosas now, just for a minute. Exactly our question. If you wait it out, she'll become Tahora. Kimo, for example, why do we care? I mean, as long as there's going to be a solution, shouldn't that be enough? Kimo, says Tosas, Achos ishto she'ein misyavemes, afilu mesa ishto acharchen. That's Tosas' succinct way of invoking the din of Nasra. Tosas is saying, if the sister-in-law, meaning the sister of his wife, was the obstacle, we wouldn't say if the obstacle goes away, because we say Nasra. So say the same thing about Nida. So Tosas says, Dilo Dami. It's not comparable. But he doesn't say for your reason. Your reason I'll get to in a minute. But he says a different reason. The akos isha v'shara rayus ha'isar omid ala yavam tfei mishar b'nei adam. Aval nida lekula alma asira. This is an interesting line in Tosas. Tosas says, listen, the problem of nida is a universal problem for anybody who would want to have a intimate encounter or relationship with this woman. It's not what Tosa seems to be saying is, it's not a kurva or a relationship issue. It's her physical state is such that she is prohibited, from this kind of activity. Right? It doesn't matter. Let's say there are 5 brothers. This is the way that some of the Rishonim say it. Let's say there are 5 brothers. Right? It will make a difference from a Nida point of view. Or to say it in a different way, it's not a relationship.
Anybody in the world, it's a problem for
her husband. It would be a problem, right? Because that's the halakha. That's the din of Taras HaMishpacha. That if she's in a state of nida, that the physical relationship between them is prohibited. So what Tosas seems to be saying is you can't compare nida and achos isha. The problem of achos isha is that she's not a good candidate, because the personal it's too incestuous, right? She's too related to him, and therefore she can't be she can't have yibum, which is a lakacha l'isha, which is an isha's relationship, because it's illicit. So here you have exactly what we're talking about, meaning what was the havamina? The havamina was it's kaive krisis. What's kaive krisis? The relationship, or the heter of implementing the yibum.
What makes
the answer
this
is implementing the yibum.
Less strong than what I said before is that somebody wanted to be argumentative, and I'm going to drop it at that because I don't want to be. He could say that one could take the other side of the argument, that it's a stronger isser.
Right. No, 100%. I think it's a great point.
All Tosfos has accomplished is to say that they're different. Okay.
Yes,
but he hasn't necessarily proven that one is stronger than the other. Which one is stronger than the other?
Right. So I don't think it's a strength thing. I think what he's saying is the 15 women of the Mishnah are prohibited because they're not good marriage partners, not because there's a technical problem in implementing Yibum. If the problem was technical problem of implementing Yibum because you don't have the rule of Aseh Dochalos Aseh because it's Alos Aseh Sheyesh Bakares, if that were the case, then Nida would be maybe even more chamor, as like you're saying, because it's to everybody. But if the problem is in finding these are not good marriage partners because it's too incestuous, right? That has nothing to do with nida.
Doesn't apply to neither.
Exactly. That's the point. Now, but I should add the following before we move further. First of all, just you should be aware that Tosar ben Peretz on Daf Tesam and Aleph asks this question in a slightly different fashion. Tosas asks the question in a substantive way, like, why, if there was this case of Nido, shouldn't that also be, Ptur, Yibum v'chalitza, and Tzara? And then Tosas gives her answer. Tosar ben Peretz on Daf Tes asks the question, how come Nida is not included in the Mishnah with the other 15 cases? And Tosas's answer is the same answer that appears in our Tosas, with the added words, and therefore the author of the Mishnah didn't think it belonged with the other cases. But the implication is that the halacha would be the same, meaning there is an actual view in the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Peretz, based on how he asks and answers the question, who really does think that we would apply the din of Nasra, as extreme as that sounds, to Anida. But that's a minority view. Now, that's point number one. Point number two, when the Rosh and the Tosas HaRosh quote this answer of Tosos, they add an extra line. They say exactly what Tosos says, namely, this is a relationship problem, meaning Achos Ishto is a relationship problem, so are all the cases of the Mishnah. Nida is not a relationship problem. It applies even to the husband.
Problem.
Good, exactly. I like that, situational problem. So they said, but then they add one extra line. And they say, after all, Nida, right, is not, I'm going to quote the line. Just give me 1 second. They quote the line, they of Tosef, and then they add, after all, Nida isn't really an erva. Here, you can't derive Nida from Achos Isha, Kamo Shara Rayos, Sha'isr Omin Alayavam Tvei Me'al Shar B'nei Adam, where the prohibition is more to this Yavam than to other candidates, because it's a relationship candidate issue, not a heter bia issue. Aval Nida L'Kula Alma Asura. Then he adds the following words: Velo Mikri Erva. It's not called an erva. De'ena Asura Mishum Kurva.
Well, he's going to have a problem because it's in the Parsha of Erevin.
Excellent. So again, I just want to talk about the Parsha for a minute. Since it's Parsha Hashavua, we always try to bring in Parsha Hashavua when we can, you know.
And it's a rare thing that Achrimos and Kedoshim are not together.
Yeah, but both of them have the Parsha of Arayas. So I'm not going to analyze the relationship between Achrimos and Kedoshim right now, even though I think there are subtle differences that are important, and I think in a way that the erva of Kedoshim is comes through, you know, an exclusion of Kedusha, and the erva of Achremos, you know, is just about erva. But what I wanted to point out is that, first of all, the introduction of the Parsha, as well as the range and the levels of erva in the Parsha. So this is in Perek Yud Ches of Vayikra. Perek Yud Ches Pasuk. Just listen to the language. Just, you know, I should also add, because I've mentioned this in the past, and I believe in it, so I'm going to repeat it again. And that is, it's a very striking thing that on Yom Kippur, you know, in the morning we read for Parshas Achrimos. It's obvious because that's the Avodas Yom Kippurim, right? Achrimos Shnei Bnei Aaron, Bezos Yava Aaron Ala Kodesh. The whole protocol of Avodas Yom Kippurim is delineated in the beginning of Parshas Achremos. What we read last week in Kriyas HaTorah is what we read on Yom Kippur Day. So that makes sense, of course, because the focal point of Yom Kippur is the Avodah. What's not obvious is the Kriyas HaTorah at Mincha on Yom Kippur, which is also from Achremos. It's the Parsha of Arayos. Why do, of all things on Yom Kippur, after Mincha, do we read the Parsha of Arayos? So the Balitosis and Megillah and the Skuni and a whole bunch of people weigh in. They have, you know, very interesting, you know, technical answers. My view is a little bit different, and that is that, you know, Bnei Noach also have Arayos, but the Parsha of Arayos and Achremos shows the expansiveness of Arayos to Yisrael. And I think it's like a very big, important snapshot of Kedusha and of Kedushas Ishus and what Yom Kippur in a way is all about. Namely, taking the physical world, you know, and spiritualizing it and giving it, you know, religious meaning and significance, you know, on the basis of discipline, you know, abstention when necessary. You know, Ishus is something that is celebrated, but only, you know, when the standards are applied. So both the expansive list of erva by means of marriage or other krovim, which we'll see in just a moment, much more so than Bnei Noach, and especially through marriage itself, where your wife's relatives also become, you know, part of the Arayos, you know, catalog. All of that bespeaks of a broader perspective on relationships in general, and especially through marriage, which is, you know, exemplifies in a very, I think, dramatic way the principle of Kedushas Yisrael. But in addition to that, you know, since Ishus is a critical dimension of Kedushas Yisrael, the fact that its standards are higher itself is part of the principle, you know, of what distinguishes Yisrael and Bnei Noach. So that's why I think
more appropriate to read
in Birchas Erison, we've talked about this in the past, the very long Birchas Vitzivanu al Ha'arayos. The first thing is you say it's Vitzivanu al Ha'arayos. And that's what the Rush famously in Ksuvah says, like, why are we negative campaigning, in this, under the chuppah, we have nothing better to say than Vitzivanu al Ha'arayos. But it's a celebration of the expanse of relationships and family relationships through marriage. And it's also a way of highlighting that the high standards, are indicative of the aspiration of sanctity. So I think that's why we read it on Yom Kippur. So having said that,
why wouldn't we read Kedoshim then?
I'm sorry?
Why wouldn't we read it from Kedoshim then?
Well, I think the main parsha of Arayos, that goes to this. I mean, the first and the main is the Nachremos of Arayos. And even, I'm not going to analyze the two parshas right now, but as I said, but I alluded to it a second ago by saying, kind of the parsha of Arayos comes through the back door of Kedoshim as like the antithesis of Kedusha. But here it's, kind of the, in its own right, it's, anyway, so the parsha, just as an example, by Dabar Shema Moshe Limor Dabero B'nei Yisrael v'Marta Aleihem. Let's read it quickly. Ani Hashem Elokechem, which we know already, but that's a way of saying, be vigilant. Our lifestyle, our aspiration, is going to be different. Ani Hashem Elokechem, and then the next words are very, powerful. Kimase Eretz Mitzrayim asher yishavtem ba lo sasu. Kimase Eretz Canaan asher ani mevi eschem shama lo sasu. Uvechukosehem lo selecho. Meaning, the culture that you just came from, the culture that you're going to encounter in Eretz Yisrael, because now they're in the midbar, in between, are immoral cultures, and they're not what you should aspire to. And even though you've had these interactions with one and you will with the other, you have to be, very vigilant that this doesn't taint your sanctity. And of course, this principle, uvechu koseim lo telechu, is the foundation for, the uniqueness of Kedushas Yisrael, whether it's in language or in clothing, certainly in behavior, the idea of chukas hagoyim, the chukoseim lo tolechu, is a broad idea. Es mishpatai ta'asu et chukosai tishmu lalechas b'hem ani Hashem Elokechem u'shmartem es chukosai es mishpatai asher yaseh ha'adam v'chai b'hem. This is also very critical. The word v'chai b'hem in this parsha, refers to the centrality of Pikuach Nefesh, and the fact that Chai Ben V'lo Shiamos Ben, typically you put the sanctity of human life above almost everything else, but not above Gili Arayos, Shvichos Damim, and Avodah Zarah.
It's strange that it should be put right here now, because it's right next to the exceptions for which Chai Ben.
Yeah, no, and I think the reason for that is because both the exception and the rule come from the principle of a Chai Ben. This is, again, my theory, but I think it's true. Meaning, you're supposed to give up, certain mitzvos for the sake of saving your life, because your life, is supposed to be dedicated to a spiritual, focus, and therefore almost like, chatei, kedei, I'm sorry, chalel Shabbos achas, kedei shetishmar Shabbosos harbe, that kind of an idea. But there are certain
lines can't be crossed.
Well, exactly. And those lines can't be crossed, not on technical grounds, but also because of the quality of life, being the determinant. Meaning, life is not going to be worth living, if it isn't just living and breathing, but it's living purposively to serve the Ribono Shel Olam, right? If you're going to cross some of those red lines. So that V'chai Bahem, really belongs here. Ani Hashem. And then comes the parsha of Arayos. Ish kol she'er b'saro, referring to his own, intrinsic relatives. That's how it starts. Lo tikrevu legalos erva. This is the beginning. Ani Hashem. And then it starts with, ervas avicha, ervas imcha, lo segale, imchahi, right? Ervas eshes avicha, lo segale. So it starts off with the erva of, incestuous relationships that are blood relationships, or the wives of blood relationships, meaning your father's, wife, your
If it's not
and
your
so on
mother.
and so forth, right? Ervas achoska. So it starts off that. I'm going to skip a little bit. Then comes ervas. I'm sorry. Then after that, you have. By the way, that includes something we talked about earlier, a bunch of things. But ervas kalaska. This is pasuk tesvav. Lo segale has a double explanation. Number one, she's your daughter-in-law. That's a direct relationship. And number two, eshes binchahi lo segale ervasa, as if to say, a daughter-in-law. There are two elements. Number one, by virtue of the fact that she married your son, she becomes your daughter-in-law, and that's an incestuous relationship. Moreover, it's a blight in your relationship with your son. It's a crossed, an unacceptable line to cross, in terms of your relationship with him, which is what we talked about earlier in the year. Anyways, this gives way to the next category, which is ervas isha ubita lo segale, and isha elachosa lo tikach litzror legala servasa aleha b'chaya, which is the Yevamos psukim, or references that we've been discussing all year round. Meaning, after speaking about direct blood, prohibitions, and the wives of direct blood relatives, the next category is the relatives of one's wife, including achos ishto, which plays this tremendously prominent role in Yibum, even though, again, it's the other sister-in-law. It's the convergence of two sisters-in-law, right? In Yibum, meaning she is the wife of your brother and she is the sister of your wife. But that's the next category, namely erva by means of ishus, of your marriage, not just, the, connected, women to your blood relatives. So that's category number two. Right. After that comes nida. The el isha benidas tumasa lo tikrav legalo servasa. And then comes Eshasish, which is also not a now that's, again, Nida's not a relationship issue. It's a, what did you call it? A situational issue, right? And either is Eshasish, really. I mean, Eshasish is and isn't. That's what we discussed, meaning it's not a relative, it's not an incestuous relationship. It's that, marriage is exclusive and she already is married to someone else. So that's El Esha Samitcha Lo Titain Shkavtecha Lazara, the Tamava. And then comes, strangely, a little of Odazara, Mizaracha Lo Titain Lahaver Lamolech. There's a very interesting relationship between Avodah Zarah and Arayos. But then comes Mishkav Zachar, right? As Zachar lo tishkav mishkave isha to'evahi. And then comes B'chol Behema lo titein shkav t'kol tamava. And then after all that, the Torah sums up, Al tetamu b'chol elu ki b'chol elu nitmu hagoyim asher ani mishaleach mipneichem. Reminds you again, this is a contrast to non-Jewish life. So the Chazan has joined us, so we welcome him. V'titzma haaretz v'efkod avona alecha v'taki haaretz es yoshveh. And this language, it's almost like Eretz Yisrael cannot tolerate, immorality, and it spits out those who violate it, which is a fascinating idea. I mean, it's like Eretz Yisrael has a personality,
which is predicting the goals.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, what I wanted to highlight here, and you have a similar pattern in Kedoshim with some very subtle and important subtle differences, is that Nida is not a relationship erva, right? It is a situational erva, we'll call it. So when Tosa Rush says it's not an erva, right? He's right and he's wrong. It's in the Parsha of Arayos. it's chayve krisus.
Not only in the parsha, it's right in the center.
It's not at the center; it's at the end,
60%.
right? Together with Esha Sish, Zachar, and Mishka Behema. But it it is different, and the proof that it's different, first of all, it's intuitively different because it comes and goes. It's not it's not a blight. It's not incestuous. It's the state of being, right? It's an isur bia essentially, not a din gavra. I'll get that in just a second. But more than that, the Gemara says, we talked about this earlier in earlier shiurim, but on Mem Tessa but Aleph and Yivamos and Samach Zayin and Kiddushin, we said there is tfisas Kiddushin benida. Right? If a person was Mekadesh and Isha Nida, the Kiddushin is Chal. Moreover, there's no mamzer, even though there's Chavi Krisus. If a person was Ba Alanida, I mean, it's a severe Isser, he violates an Isser Kares. But there's no mamzerus.
How come Tosfos doesn't ask the same question if the Yibum would occur in Yom Kippur? They can't make Yibum because she's Nessa in Yom Kippur.
I think some Achronim asked that question. That's a really interesting question.
I mean, the obvious answer will be, wait a second. I mean, Yom Kippur was declared one day that you can't have this relationship.
Right. That's clearly extraneous. I'll go better. Some of the Maram Rudberg has a tshuva in which he says, how far are you going to take this din of Nasra? Because in one respect, every time the woman becomes an Esha Sameis, her husband dies, she's also an Onain. And as an Onain, she's prohibited from having any kind of intimate relations. So as such, you could say Nasra, and then there would never be Ibum. Right?
So when can Yibum take place after the death of the husband?
Say that again.
How long does one have to wait to have a Yibum? A lady?
Yeah, there's no time, as we discussed before. There's no timetable, but the din of Nasra, which we were discussing earlier, is defined by the beginning of the process, even though there is no, there's no set timetable. I mean, you shouldn't drag it out, obviously, because she's a kind of a naguna, but because she's mizukekes and she's not muteris lashuk. But there's no official timetable, so it could take a long time. Anyways, getting back to the Nidas, there is Tfisas Kiddushin, unlike every other member of Parshas Harayos. There is no Mamzerus. So it's different. It comes and goes. It's part of the rhythm of life, right? And as you said before, and that's a correct point too, it's made to be temporary. So that's it. Is it understandable that the Tosarosh goes further and says, even though it's in the Parsha of Arayos, maybe just to establish that it's Chayve Krisus, it's not really an erva. But I want to contrast this. I should have put it on the sheet maybe, but with the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Ishus, Parak Aleph, and then again later on Parak Dalid, and in Hilchos Isurei Bia, Parak Dalid, and Yud Zayin, and all over Isurei Bia, and in Hilchos Isurei Mizbeach, context of what we call Esnan Zona. The Rambam, whenever he mentions Nida and its exceptions, like, Kiddushin is Tofes. Even though there's Chayve Krisus, there's no Mamzerus, etc. Whenever the Rambam does that, he always uses the following phrase. Afapi Shenida Ervahi, right? And sometimes he'll say, Afapi Shenida Ervahi, right? Uksuva beparshas Arayos, Mikol Makom, as if to say, I don't agree with the Bali Tosfos, who think that these exceptions in Nida mean it's not erva. I think it's erva, but it's a different kind of erva. The truth is that the argument between the Rambam and Bali Tosfos, I think, is very characteristic of their relationship of the relationship that each has to Torah Shebechsav's impact on the halacha, to make it clear. For Balitosis, and this isn't always true, but I think it is generally true, something I've noticed for sure. Like Balitosis don't put much stock in how we know certain halachas. That's not the big issue. Like what the nature of the limud is. Is it explicit in Torah Shebechsav? Is it learned out from a limud? Which limud? For them, this is all just one big chol. It all provides information. So whether something is derived, from halakha l'moshe misinai or a drasha, or it's mefurish bakra, or it's against the pshat, or it's consistent with the pshat, it's all information.
Whole order. The Rambam has the whole order of exactly.
Yeah. But the Rambam always is super sensitive, acutely sensitive, hypersensitive to how we know certain halachas, right? He'll quote, odd, from our point of view, let's say more exotic, we'll call it, Mekoros for certain halachos, like he'll go to the Medrash if he doesn't like the Gemara's Makar, assuming that it makes a difference. The Rambam's whole idea of Divrei Sofrim is a hierarchy. So I think the Rambam in general assumed that, that the presentation of Torah Shebechsav, or the methodology of how we learn in Torah Shebaal Peh, certain halachos, plays a role conceptually in especially hierarchically, how we understand like the relationship or the levels of different halachos. So I think this is a great example of it. The Balitosis are quick to dismiss the presence of Nida in the Parsha of Erva. What they think it means is it's Chai Misa Kares, it's Isurei Bia Bekares. But what they're more impressed with is the fact that there's Tvisas Kedushin, there's no Mamzeros, and so on. Whereas the Rambam, as I say, all over, it's not, you can't miss it. It's in Ishus and Isurei Bia many times, Isurei Mizbeach. The Rambam always, in Pirush Mishnayos in a few places, the Rambam will always say Nida, even though it's an erva, still. Now, there's a way, I think, also, I should also mention that it isn't just the Tosa Rosh reading of this Tosas here. It's also Rabbeinu Tam and Sefer Yashar and Simon Peites, Os Beis. The Rabbeinu Tam says this very explicitly, that in his view, Nida isn't a typical Arayos, or it's Arayos in name only. And the Ravan, also on Kufir Aleph in Yevamos, also says this. Now they have different points, like in Rabbeinu Tam and Sefer Yashar, he says, after all, there's Tvisas Kedushin. In the Ravan, I think he says, after all, even a Baal, even a husband, has and a wife have to contend with the situation of Nida, and it comes and goes. So that can't be an erva. Now, I do think that there's a way, like, to navigate between these two perspectives, and that is to make the argument that Nida is a Maisa erva. I mean, the intimate, action, notwithstanding Yiba, is a violation of Gilui Arayos as an action. But what Nida is not is a Gavra erva, meaning it's not. You don't look at the relationship in advance and say, she's an erva. What you say is the Maisa under these conditions is a Maisa Arayos. Her status is not erva, but the action, the heter of Ishus, collides with an act of erva, a Maisa of Gilei Arayos. So, for example, this is a big question with regard to the problem of Yehorig Val Yavor. Like, we have a rule, as we discussed, we mentioned it a few minutes ago, just very briefly. V'chai bahem, normally, v'chai bahem v'lo she'amas bahem, means a heter pikuach nefesh. And there are three known, absolute exceptions. Gilei Arayos, Avodah Zarah, right? Shvichos Damim. like murder, idolatry, and again this violation of of morality of Gilead Arayos, correct? So what is Gilead Arayos legabe Hareg Vayavar? It's just to give up your life. We explained a few minutes ago. It says v'chai bahem in this parsha because the Sefer Chinuch says what I was trying to say before, which is that your life is worthwhile because you can sanctify it. You can serve the Rabbanu Shalom with it. But certain red lines make your life not worthwhile. So the same v'chai bahem, which is a heter pikuach nefesh, is a red line, when it comes to Gilead Arayos Avodah Zarah and Shvichas Dam. Anyways, so Gilead Arayos, what is the Gilead Arayos definition when it comes to Yehareg Vayavar? So there are some Rishonim who think I have a very expansive definition that whenever there's a prohibition, whenever there's not a permissible relationship, even if it's only even if it's not a capital offense, that would be what they call abizrayu de Gilead Arayos, and you'd say a Hareg Vayavar. That's not the majority view. The majority view is it has to be like a serious erva.
Capital offense.
Does it include nida? That's an interesting question because, as we're pointing out, nida is in the list of akremos and kedoshim, and at the same time, there's tfisas kiddushin and there's no mamzeros.
But the Rambam would say it isn't if he considers it an error.
Yeah. So the Minchas Chinuch, in discussing this question, says, well, I think the Rambam would consider it to be Gilead Arayos, but he also thinks it depends. The Ra'ah, I should add, quoted by the Ritva in Masachet Psachim, and Daf Chafei says explicitly that nida matzilin osa b'nafsho and Yehareg Vayavar. The Minchas Chinuch discusses it. The Mishnah says on Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph in Sanhedrin that when it comes to Gilead Arayos matzilin osa b'nafsho, meaning if a person is trying to against the will of the partners, trying to commit an act of Gilead Arayos, so someone could stop him, even if it means forfeiting his life. In other words, you try to stop him, without,
Killing
him. But if the only way to stop him from committing this act in a violent way also is to kill him, then matzilin oso b'nafsho, which by literally means that we're saving him from himself. We're not just
preserving his future olam.
Yeah, we're spiritually saving him from himself. So the question:
who is doing the matzilim here? Is it
third party?
I'm sorry.
A third party.
Some Pinchas.
You mean is it an aid that has to do it?
It doesn't have to be an aid, an observer. It could be an aid. Somebody says to him, "You can't do that." That's that's an act of prohibited. That's prohibited, and it's so but he ignores it. So we try to stop him, without using lethal force, I guess is the right terminology.
Unless it's a public issue like Pinchas and Zimri.
No, yeah, but that's different. That's Kanoim Pogimbo. And she was a willing partner. That's a little bit of a different, and she was a non-Jew, but that's a bit of a different issue. But the din of matzilin osa b'nafsho, which is it's a Mishnah in Sanhedrin Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, is the lead-in to the Yehareg Vayavar, so again, Ayin Daled Amud Beis. So the Ritva in Psachim on Daf Kafei quotes his Rabbi, the Ra'ah, as saying that the din of matzilin osa b'nafsho applies also to nida, because even though it isn't a typical erva, it's still subject to matzilin osa b'nafsho. But others disagree. So this is all part of this grand argument that comes to kind of a head in this process.
Rishonim follow that the Rambam and that same thinking.
Well, I think so. Yeah. I think the majority view is that. Okay, so that's one. Then if you continue in the Tosafos, we're going to stop in one more minute. then Tosa says something quite amazing in the continuation. Tosa says, "V'afilu b'nidasa mashma b'psachim sof perak elu dvarim debas yibum hi." So I'm just going to explain that for a minute. Tosa says, if you look carefully at the Gemara in Psachim, I'm not going to read the Gemara in Psachim right now, it would appear that if, let's say, he's not allowed to be miyavim her if she's a nida. That's clear. But Tosa's just explained there's no nasra either because she's not an erva, or because it's not like achos ishto, or what you suggested, which we'll see later on, which is that it's fundamentally temporary as opposed to something like achos isha, which may end up being temporary, but you can't know that in advance, right? But now Tosa says something else. Tosa says, what would happen if he were to illegally do an act of yibum with her? He's not allowed to, because bakaris. But let's say he did.
There be a tefisas kedushin? Is that the question?
Tosa says, so Tosa reads the Gemara in Psachim as saying the yibum would be chal. The first day Tosis thought that it would not. So what makes more sense? Should the yibum be chal b'di'evet or not?
Is it chal by kedushin?
Ah, exactly. Excellent. The answer is yes. Kedushin is tofes b'nida. So why wouldn't it be tofes?
Why should it be any different?
Yeah. So the first day
it should be different because of what we've been saying all along. This is situational, and the yibum is an existing impossible error relationship wise.
Meaning it's more sensitive in some respect. So that's exactly it. So what emerges in these two deos, this day in Tosa says, Kedushin is tofes benida. So Yibum b'di'evet is tofes benida. So you're not allowed to do it, but it's not nesra, because if you were to go ahead and do it, it would work. So there is a zika, and it's a viable zika, and whatever the technical prohibition is, you can for sure wait it out. It's not nesra. But the other view previously thought that not true. That if you were to be biyabim the nida, would it work? So the question is, why not? It works in kedushin. So this is an example. That's what you just said. It's repeating what you just said, which we've seen all year round, which is this very interesting tension between two opposite themes. On the one hand, Yibum is a kula. Yibum is a rule breaker. Yibum is, it's Eishes Ach. And Mishum, Lahakim Lahakiv Shem Yisrael, you're permitted to break all these rules. So you would think that, it's not going to be more difficult than Kiddushin. It's going to be easier because we're facilitating it. We're enabling it. On the other hand, precisely because we are pushing the envelope in this Ishos, right, by permitting Eishes Ach, which is normally a very prominent, component in Parshas Arayos. So we have to make sure that this is done Kedasu Kedin. I like always to quote.
A little bit of Abba Shaul here, no?
Exactly, Abba Shaul. That's what I always like to quote. So even if you don't hold like Abba Shaul, but the Abba Shaul, principle, which is that you have to be more careful and be on a higher level in Yibum in order to justify. So maybe that's the reason why, even though Kedushin is Tofes Benida, maybe the first day of Tosis is that Yibum is not Tofes Benida. So let me mention the third day in Tosis, and we'll pick up with it next week, because this is very interesting in its own right. The third day of Tosis, I'll just tell you what it says before we read it in next week. The third day of Tosis says, the whole din of Nesra is based on the principle of Drachel Darchei Noam. What is Drachel Darchei Noam? Well, we say it or we sing, it's Pasuk in Mishlei, right? Which asserts that the ways of the Torah are Darchei Noam, are pleasant, right? What does that have to do with Nida? So there's a Gemara in. I'm sorry. What does that have to do with Yibum and with Nida? So the Gemara later on in Pei Zayin Amud Beis says something very interesting. The Gemara wonders. Let's say there was a child in existence when the husband died. Okay, Reuven was married to Rachel, and they had a child, Ploni, um, at the time of his death. And then later, the child dies. So the Gemara says, how come?
Oh, there is no Yibum.
What's that?
I'll get through other questions. Bad question.
Okay. So, meaning there was no Yibum at the time of the Misa because it was a child. Would there be Yibum Lemafreya once the child dies? So the Gemara says, no, we don't make Mesim into Chayim. This is the Gemara in Peizayin Beis, because it's it would be a violation of Drachel Darchei Noah. So what is that? Drachel Darchei Noah is a pasuk in Mishlei. So it sounds like we'll discuss it more next week. That it would be you're gonna. Yibum is a very. I'll tell you my take on it. It's a little bit different than Rashi and Tosas, but we'll get that next week. Yibum is a very sensitive area, as we know. In all levels, in the best of times, the tensions are just endemic, to what it is. So, what the Gemara in a broad way is saying is, the sensitivities here are being pushed, to the extreme, in the best of circumstances. You're asking, this woman who is married to his brother, and now you're asking them both, to assume a very different kind of relationship, which under other conditions would be a betrayal of the brother, but now is going to be, a legacy for him.
Walking a tightrope.
What's that?
Walking a tightrope.
You're walking a very tightrope, which is responsible for a lot of the phenomena that we're seeing. So what the Gemara is saying is, and in addition to that, you're going to say, oh, there was no Yibum when he died, but we're going to open that parsha up again if the child dies and she's still single?
Would be retroactive.
Retroactively?
It would be retroactively as if the child never existed.
Yeah, so the Gemara says we're not going to do that, meaning not midrabanan, midarais. The Torah isn't going to do that. Drachel darchei Noah. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. So
what would that mean? Pleasant. Pleasant is not a legal concept.
Right. So very rarely, let me just give a little background, and in the non-Orthodox or halachic movements of Judaism in the last 2.5 centuries, have seized upon like certain the ones who still had some connection to it. That's also Madrega, so they seized on certain concepts, that were more flexible and, that were more, adaptable to their own, more liberal, they were acculturated or more and more and less committed, but many of them didn't want to turn their back completely on Judaism or even, professed not to want to, and some sincerely didn't want to abandon the halacha, which was so central to, to Jewish identity all the years. So their tactic was, to kind of reinterpret it or to invoke some broad, ethical, monotheistic, or broad moral, principles, and say, oh, that's how you're supposed to implement the halakha in our time. So, for example, the term, as we know, tikkun olam, right, became like a catch-all. Whenever you want to, do something. That is, some tikkun olam is a legitimate notion. I mean, it exists. However, the usage of tikkun olam, sometimes is a battering ram, for other ideologies or against the halacha, to sanction all sorts of things is kind of the phenomenon that emerged. So there's something similar happened with Durachel Darchei Noah. We find in the Gemara it's used in a very limited way. I'll just give an example. We'll talk about it next week. But the Gemara in Sukkah talks about
complete phrase is Eitz Chaim Hila Machazikim Bo Tomchea Musha V'Darchea Darchei Noam. You have to have the whole phrase to really appreciate the weight of the phrase.
Yeah, it has to be part of Eitz Chaim Hila Machazikim.
Yeah,
right, 100%. So people took it on. I'm just saying it's one of these things that even sincere people, but unknowingly, took out of context. So, for example, the Gemara says in Sukkah, this is a real thing, just like our is a real thing. Is the Gemara says they were trying to figure out what could be used for hadassim. So there was a certain kind of hadass that had thorns in it. So the Gemara says it can't be that type is what we mean by hadassim, because what, you're going to pick up the daled minim and have blood on your hands, literally, because of the thorns. That wouldn't be drachei darchei noam. So here and there, the Gemara does use drachei darchei noam to exclude something which is particularly unpleasant. As you can understand, that's very different than saying that that you can change the halacha, or that you can broadly apply Jewish law just on the basis of whether or not it meets with your sensibility or not, right? So you have to be very careful how you apply such examples. However, it happens to be the case, and this is what I want to discuss a little bit next week, that when it comes to the daled minim that we take on Sukkos, and when it comes to Yibum, there's the Talmud in particular does emphasize a couple of places in each case this principle of drachei darchei noam. And the question is why? And I think I know the answer, and I'll expand on it. But I think the answer is because daled minim is about hadar and simcha, and Yibum is about sensitivity, as they say, in walking a very fine line, and therefore the sensibilities of the people involved becomes very important. But even then, you can only use it in a way. So the third answer of Tosas here is that the principle of Nasra, this idea that everything that is excluded the first moment of the Zika is forever excluded. Tosas says that's based on drachei darchei noam. Doesn't say that in the Gemara, but Tosas extended what it does say in the Gemara. I'll show you how to this. So then Tosas says, but that doesn't apply to Nida, because a husband and wife have to be careful about Taharas HaMishpacha. That's not a problem of drachei darchei noam. That's just part of the rhythm of the purity of halachic life. So you're not going to apply Nasra if it's based on drachei darchei noam to waiting a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is. So I want to discuss that principle of drachei darchei noam a little bit more next week, and then move on to the Gemara, back to the Gemara in Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, where we talk about Sota and Maksud Rushaso as other candidates as well. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. It's good to see you back, and we look forward to continuing Mir Hashem next week.
Good night.